Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the nature of proficiency scales. My name is Sean Duncan. I'm the Strategic Change Officer with Empower Learning, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. So I work with schools and districts to understand their needs and provide both training and technology solutions to help them make that transition to standards-based and competency-based learning. Today's session is part of a broader series housed around the topic of using proficiency scales in a competency-based system. Today's focus, as I mentioned, is understanding the nature of proficiency scales. The other two sessions will cover understanding the design principles of proficiency scales and understanding effective routines for the use of proficiency scales. I'm lucky to be joined today by Dr. Robert Marzano and Empower Learning Executive Director for Client Services, Matt Shea. Before I introduce them though, I'd like to cover a few logistical items for today, and we'll come back to those introductions. Feel free to follow us on Twitter at EmpowerCBE, on Facebook, Empower Learning Competency-Based Education. Our website is empowerlearning.net, not .com, but .net. And we have a wealth of free resources there. So feel free to check those out. And then we will be playing a pre-recorded presentation of Dr. Marzano and Matt Shea. However, we are also on in the background live and will be actively monitoring questions that you submit via the Q&A button and chat, chat activity through the chat feature. When we're finished with the playback of that pre-recorded presentation, we will all come back on to have a further discussion around questions that you submit via Q&A. So that will be Dr. Marzano, Matt Shea, and myself will come back on video and address questions live. So quick introductions for Dr. Marzano and Matt Shea. Dr. Marzano is the co-founder and chief academic officer of Marzano Resources. He is the founder of the Marzano Academies, and we are lucky here at Empower Learning to have him as our executive director. So he has been in the education field for about 53 years now, and during that time, he's worked with educators as a speaker, a trainer, a consultant. He's authored many books. I believe it's over 50, and if I'm not mistaken, he's currently working on 3 as we speak. He's obviously also written a number of articles, and between books and articles, these have covered topics like assessment, instruction, writing and implementing proficiency scales, which is obviously germane to today's topic, and competency-based education. And that's just to name a few. So welcome, Dr. Marzano. And then Matt Shea, as I mentioned, is our Executive Director for Client Services. He is a former teacher. He's been in a curriculum director role and has been a district administrator in a proficiency-based or competency-based district in Maine. So he's experienced in leading the shift from a traditional system to a competency-based system as both a teacher and administrator. So welcome, Matt. And with that, we'll go ahead and play this video. And again, submit Q&A. We're monitoring live and monitoring chats, and we'll be back on with you shortly.
Well, let's start with the problems with the current approach to curriculum. As you are well aware, as K-12 educators, curriculum is intimately tied with standards. And the standards movement actually started in 1989, 11 years before the turn of the millennium in the United States. And we said, as a group, let's identify what students should know and be able to do. And there was a huge effort to identify in the major subject areas, well, what do students need to know in 3rd grade math and 5th grade math and 8th grade math? And what do they need to know in science and social studies and the arts, et cetera, et cetera. It was a powerful movement, it really was. But here's what happened. When all the standards were out, and they were kind of national exemplars at first and then translated into state standards, what we realized, there's way too much content to teach. It's just, you can't possibly do it. In the early 90s, I worked at a great organization called McCrell, and myself and a gentleman named John Kendall did a study where we asked teachers to look at the national standards for their subject area and grade level and estimate, well, how long would it take to teach this in terms of class periods? Here's what we found. If you were to try to teach all that content without adding days to the school year or time to the school day, you'd have to change school from K through 12 to K through 22. And unfortunately, although the problem isn't as bad as that, it still exists right now. Now, with all of that content out there, the teacher can't possibly teach. Here's what you find, that teachers have to pick and choose. I mean, they realize I've got a 180-day school year and I've got all of this content to teach. So they do pick and choose. So what you get, even though they pick and choose well, is very different content across classrooms. So theoretically, well, not actually, you get a large school and let's say there are 4 different teachers teaching mathematics at 4th grade, and you'll find that they might pick and choose different topics. Just because they've selected things that are different from what other teachers have selected. And then finally, there are just potential gaps in understanding of the standards. That's on the part of the students, given that they're taught different things. We really don't have a guaranteed curriculum that's actually viable, that teachers have enough time to teach. Okay, that's a curriculum issue. Let's look at another issue. This is grading now, so obviously, the curriculum is what is taught, and then teachers have to take student scores on that and turn it into a grade. And actually, curriculum developers for years have talked about 3 types of curriculum. There's the intended curriculum, then there's the taught curriculum, and then there's the assessed curriculum. Now, the intended curriculum is what, as the name implies, what is intended to be taught to students in a given subject area and grade level. The taught curriculum is what is actually taught. We just talked about that, a few minutes ago, and that is teachers have to pick and choose. And then there's the assessed curriculum. And the assessed curriculum, if it's from a state test, it might be tightly aligned to the intended curriculum, but not to the taught curriculum, or it might not be that aligned. And then at the classroom level, same things. The assessed curriculum, given what teachers have chosen to teach, might not be aligned well, with the breadth of the intended curriculum. Along with that problem, what you'll find is that it's still common practice is when an overall omnibus grades are given, and they could be letter grades, or an omnibus grade also can manifest as a percentage score. Teachers will commonly throw in a lot of things that have nothing to do with the content taught, extra credit, effort, et cetera, et cetera. And so we really don't know what that letter grade or percentage score means in a lot of cases. Now, this is all backdrop for, well, why might we look at proficiency scales?
So one of the things that segues well with what Dr. Marzano was just talking about was I was thinking about my first year of teaching in a very traditional system, and it got to be the end of the year, and I had some students in a 0 to 100 world. We're at like a 68 and a 69, and they wanted to pass the class, and I wanted to pass the class. And the things that I was doing with these kids, I knew wasn't right. I was trying to find some standards that I knew they were going to be okay at in order for them to average up to a 70 grade. And it didn't really matter what I was choosing because, again, we were close to the end of the year. I had to get them to an overall 70 or at least like a 69.51 so I could have some type of justification. But I found myself doing all those things that we just talked about, throwing in extra credit and effort and adjusting my point scales for what they were doing. And I knew it wasn't right, but that's the world that I was living in. So the next year when our district started thinking about doing something called standards-based grading, I was very interested. And part of it is what you see on screen here. At least we started breaking up these standards into different like mini areas, like number sense and decimals and fractions. So at least we kind of knew a little bit more than we did before, rather than an 82 equals a B, because we get 1 grade per content area. At least we could start breaking it up a little bit. We couldn't exactly tell what the child mastered. We didn't know what they needed more time on, but at least we had a little bit more information. So I found myself, very happy at that point that I didn't have to do all this scrambling to average everything up to the appropriate grade. I could at least get at least 1 layer better than we had before. That was a huge help. However, when we talk about the difference between traditional grading and standards-based grading, there's a lot more to it than just trying to get a tiny bit more information. As we've mentioned before, traditional grades are usually based on 1 grade per subject. They're based on percentages or letter grades. They're basically calculated on an average, as we've discussed. Everything gets lumped into 1 big score. They are usually based on summative scores. So your tests and your quizzes, but not a lot of things we do along the way. And as we mentioned, the behavior and the effort and the work habits and all of that extra stuff also goes into the grade for a particular content area. I think we all kind of realize at this point, a lot of those things aren't ideal. And at the same time, that's the world we live in. So as we're talking today about a standards-based grading system, this is a different opportunity to see what is potentially out there. Now we can give a score for each one of our standards. We can use a scale to report on those standards. And we'll get into what a scale looks like momentarily. We can talk about proficiency or mastery or competency that's determined on a mounting evidence level rather than just averaging stuff together. We talk about preponderance of evidence and having an entire base of evidence that we look at to see where the kid is right at this particular moment. That it clearly implies that kids have an opportunity to master these things over time. And as teachers, we already know that some kids learn a little bit quicker than others, and some kids learn particular standards a little bit quicker than others. And you have a whole variety of students that do both of those things. So if I need a little bit more time to learn something, there's nothing wrong with that. If I need a little bit less time to learn something so I can move on, there's also nothing wrong with any of those. So the structures that are in place to do those things need to be presented in the classroom or in the school at the same time.
Hey, Matt, can I comment on the standards-based part?
Please.
Yeah, this, if you look at the right-hand column there, that's pretty straightforward. And in general, teachers at all levels will say, it makes sense to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
However, it is a sea change to think this way.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to realize that. So, Matt's demonstrating the first step, and that is just talk about the logic of this and what would standards-based looks like. And that's a great list right there. Mm-hmm. But then people say, oh my God, if I do it this way, then I have to do this differently and this differently and this. And the answer is yes, and that's okay. And you might not be able to pull that off overnight, but yes, your thinking will change. You'll see the world completely differently. You'll see the curriculum differently. You'll see your students differently. And that's actually the thing that once teachers get into it, that really get them hooked. They say, I like this. This perspective gives my students a lot more flexibility, and it gives me a lot more flexibility and knowledge of what they know and don't know.
That was exactly how I learned over time, from a super traditional system into like, hey, what if? Oh, would I have to do this? What are my students responding in a slightly better way? And if they're slightly better way, maybe there's another better way that I can even get more knowledge out of them, and they can see that. So you're right, it all builds on each other over time. So when we talk about scales are really the key part to a good standards-based grading system. There's if you don't have scales, I think when you're trying to do standards-based grading, you still are going to run into some issues in the classroom, mainly related to equity. So let's talk about some of those attributes. A scale, as we're going to describe a little more in depth in a little bit, we have a clear continuum of knowledge for a particular standard or measurement topic. Okay, that's super important to a kid because it's going to be open and transparent to them also, rather than that scale be stuck in a teacher's head and kids have to kind of figure out what they're learning from the teacher point of view. It's all right in front of them. The language of that scale is the feedback. We can use that scale to give feedback to kids so they're understanding exactly what they know, and they just don't get a grade that kind of reports to them what they know. Bob, you're at a B today. Great. What does that mean? If you have a scale, you can point to the things that you do know and the things that you still need to be able to work on. That student evidence scored against the scales, as we just kind of implied here. And the score represents what you know now and what you need to know next. So if I'm sitting at a 2, it's not that I'm partially proficient or I'm almost there. I can point to exactly what I have learned and what I have yet to learn. So let's start out with what a simplified scale would look like on a 0 to 4 scale. Clearly, a 3 is the pretty much, this is your target right here. The 3 is when you've demonstrated competency or mastery or proficiency or whatever language that you want to use. That's the target. That's the non-negotiable part that we have on a scale. A 2.0 is just a simpler or a more foundational learning goal. So the 2 and 3 are super important. And they're usually, this is where you're going to see all of that specific information of content, knowledge, and skills that kids are to be learning and being able to demonstrate that mastery or proficiency on. So the 1.0 is a with help, I can do some of the things at the 2.0 and 3.0 level. A 0 is even with help, I don't have any success. Sometimes people decide to present no score on that one because kids are not providing any evidence, even with help. And a 4.0 is a more complex learning goal or going beyond the 3.0 in some fashion. So that's one of our simplified scales. We also have a more complex scale, which has half points. And we're going to talk about half points for a little bit because I really like the half points for a number of reasons. So let's talk about what all the half points mean, first of all. So let's start at the 2.5 right in the middle here. A 2.5 means that I have basically in a short version, I've got all the 2.0 level content. Now, it doesn't mean I have every specific one, but as you can see here, the student makes no major errors or omissions regarding 2.0 content. So they've got the foundational pieces, and I've got partial success at the 3.0. So I've got some of the 3.0 stuff, some more of the complex learning goals here, but I don't have all of it yet. So I'm at a 2.5. So I'm getting there, but I'm not quite there yet. Same thing at the 1.5. I've got partial success at a level and full success at a level below, as you can see with the different scores with all the 0.5s. So the 0.5s are really important when we have a scale for a few reasons. First of all, it provides teachers with more options to really target where a kid is in their learning. So if we're thinking of more of the simplified scale with just the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, if we think about where kids are and when they're learning, if I'm working on the foundational level and then I finally have shown over that preponderance of evidence that I'm at that foundational level and I've got all of that stuff, awesome, I'm at a 2. So now I'm working at the 3.0 level. The 3.0 level, by definition, is more complex. It's at a higher rigor level. It's going to be a little harder for kids. So they're working on this. They're working on it. They got some of it. They don't quite have all of it. If you don't have half points, the kid is going to be at a 2 for a very long time, potentially. So the motivation that we have from a kid point of view, if I'm sitting at a 2.0 on a target in November, let's say, and I'm working really hard at that 3.0 level, but I'm just not quite got all of it yet. And I'm running through December and then it gets into January and I can't see any progress. I've got my feedback from my teacher. I'm working on providing evidence. I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to. The teacher's doing everything they're supposed to, but there's no mechanism for them to show any type of growth at all. So we really prefer having the half points.
Can I add to that, Matt?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, this particular scale, by the way, was developed in early 1990s. So we've been working with this for a long time. And we put the half-point scores in initially because what we found our teachers were more accurate when they scored if we had half-point scores. Now, there are some folks who say, no, you shouldn't use half-point. Well, I think they're not talking about this scale. Because if actually you could try it out, you can get, groups of teachers and have them use just only whole points versus half points, and you'll see much more agreement if they use half points. However, it's what Matt's talking about that we came up later when, students were actually using this, that has become the most important reason for having the half point scores. They don't get stuck, at the 2.0 forever, or the 1.0. Yeah, so it's really powerful. And actually, there are some schools that use quarter point scores that we've got a scale for that too, if you'd like to see it. But it even they can even make finer steps up the ladder. So it's a huge motivational piece for students.
So if I'm a student and I'm looking at a particular scale and I'm at a 2.5 right now, I can articulate that to not only the teacher and to my peers, but to my parents, exactly where I am, that I've got all the 2.0 level stuff. I'm working on the 3 level stuff. I have some evidence, but I'm not quite all there at that particular point. With that content, I know exactly the pieces of the 3.0 content that I have and the evidence that I've submitted and been scored at. And I know what I'm missing specifically, so I can work on those specific level of knowledge and skills in order to learn the 3. And now I can realize that I am moving up the scale. I am seeing my progress right on this scale because of the evidence that I've provided. As we spoke a little bit before, those individual moves from a 1.5 to a 2, from a 2 to a 2.5 are really important when we talk about student motivation and really creating that sense of agency that a kid has about their learning at that particular point, because they can see the growth that they are making, and they can be proud of where they are right now and where they are going next, whether it be from a 3 beyond that to a 3.5 and a 4, or they're ready to move on to the next learning target in the procession.
Let me add a piece to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, we've been working with this for a long time, but I want you to just think for a second about the potential impact if your school, or better yet, your district, reported in subject areas, every subject areas, they had topics that had proficiency scales, and they did their reporting about individual students using the scale. Think of the commonality you have and the interpretability you have, because now I'm a parent. And say, once parents get it, they say, now I know that no matter what class my child is in, if I see a 2.5, and I ask the teacher, so what's this topic? What's the proficiency scale for that? I can immediately interpret what it means. Oh, so my child, they know this 2.0 stuff that's on the scale, but they're not there at the 3.0 yet. That is massive. That commonality. Just imagine a school, or better yet, a district doing this. And if you're thinking about, what about overall grades? You can change these scores into overall omnibus letter grades, percentage grades. We've got the conversion charts if you want to see those. So it really is just a very powerful, way of improving, grading and reporting. And the omnibus grade, if that's the only thing you use, you just can't get near this.
The next time, we'll be talking about the design principles of proficiency scales in part 2 of this series.
Okay, thanks so much. We did get some questions that we received. Before I jump into those, we will address those live. Matt and myself and Dr. Marzano will answer those live. Matt just finished off the video by talking about the other 2 webinars. I posted something to the chat with the dates and times for those. If you're not already registered for those, you have a couple of options. Either email me directly. I'm happy to add you to the distro list. I send out an email with notifications about this with the registration link. or I also post stuff on our social media account. So the Twitter address is in there if you want to follow us there. So you'll stay up to date. So with that said, let's jump into some Q&A. Okay, so the first question we received is from Tammy. So a 2 could be something like, quote, I can factor a quadratic with a leading coefficient of 1, and a 2 could be something like, I can factor a quadratic with a leading coefficient greater than 1. So should I think of scales as the roadmap to the final goal, not gradations of smaller goals?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, start with a 3. If you're designing proficiency scales for a school or district or at the individual teacher level, you first start with, okay, what's the proficiency that I want to get them to? And that's really important because everything is relative to that 3.0. And it really matters. If obviously talking about secondary math, but if you're talking about primary word recognition skills, the 3 looks very different than the 3 you've just identified. So if you start with that, then you ask yourself, what is the information or what are the basic skills that are necessary for students to do the 3 that I'm probably going to have to teach? And that's, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but saying it all depends on what your 3 is. The problem, and then a 4 is going above and beyond. Some teachers prefer just to keep that kind of loose. The general phrase we use is students can make inferences and applications at the 4 level. They can make inference. They can do everything you want at the 3 level. At the 4, they can make inferences and applications that go beyond what was explicitly taught. The problem, although it's kind of the same, the problem of having a bunch of goals and then lining them up is they might not be that related, and so you're kind of mapping backward here. What do I want them to accomplish? That's a 3.0. What do they need that I'm going to probably teach directly versus and then go above me. Although, in practice, teachers, I've seen scales that were designed that way, and then teachers refer to the different elements at the 2.0 level as individual targets. Hope that answered the question.
Good deal. Okay. And Tammy, if you have any follow-up questions around that, just go ahead and post that to the Q&A and we'll address that live like we just did that one. So same goes for anybody's questions here. So our next question is from Alyssa. She says, my district is starting to use Empower this next school year. We are adopting the Marzano proficiency scales. I believe that is referring to the critical concepts scales. As we embark on this shift for a lot of staff, would you recommend starting with half points or just starting with the more basic, simple scales for staff? Implementation wise, what have you seen as easier and more streamlined?
I'm going to jump in on this one too. Sorry, Matt. You can say what Bob really meant to say with his answer, and I will not feel offended. Yeah, no, half point scores. Yeah, because what you will find is Matt, addressed in our in the pre-recorded tape. What we try to do in the series is break this into digestible chunks, about 20 minutes each. And that's why we pre-recorded them. Yeah, I see. I think whole point scores, even though it sounds, oh, this is simpler, it's not. It's not, in the sense that teachers will be stuck, especially at the secondary level, will be stuck with, well, wait a minute. They got the 2.0 and a little bit of the 3. I got to give them a 2. And you really get into that. Students are at the 2 forever. Some schools, actually, this comes from Lindsay Unified School District, and one of their implementations of the scales in mathematics, they actually keep track of how many steps, they call it, in a given week students have made, because they find that so motivational. So even though it seems it's easier, to assign whole point scores, I would assert, I don't think it is. I think it's harder because you're really stuck between what happens. I know they've got some of the stuff at a higher level, and they got all of it at this level. And we really found out kind of the hard way that whole point scores can create all kinds of issues and questions with the not only student motivation, but accurately assigning scores to students that represent where they are. Go ahead, Matt. I'll shut up.
Well, I was going to say pretty much that exact same thing, Bob, of course. But you're right. It's very frustrating if you have only whole point scores, because even though it seems like it's a nice entry point, which is what the question kind of implies here, when you get into practice of it, teachers realize, oh my God, as you said, and students will be the same thing. They'll be like, I'm not showing any progress, therefore the motivation decreases, and you find yourself in a big mess, and then you move to half point scores anyway. So my advice strongly is start that way from the beginning. Absolutely.
Okay. Next question. We have had some teachers make the assumption that a score 2.0 on one proficiency scale is the same content as a score 3.0 on a lower level proficiency scale, meaning a lower grade level, I assume. How important is it that there's a different progression from one development level to the next, meaning grade level to the next, as well as a progression within a single proficiency scale?
I'm going to jump in on that one too. No, by the way, first of all, if something's working for you, do it. You know, they're really, that's what if you can make it work, you know, you do it. And because there's no one way to create a CBE system, there's no one way to create a proficiency scale, even using our overall framework. That said, I recommend against that. I really do. The idea of having a proficiency scale, you know, for a particular topic at a particular grade level gives you finer discrimination within that topic at that grade level. If you plug in, you know, like I've heard some people have said, well, we'll make the 4 the 3.0 at the next level. It really kind of decreases the amount of specificity you could get within your grade level. It also kind of assumes that you've got a great vertical alignment with all your proficiencies, and that might not be the case. There are some topics that kind of end at a certain grade level, you know, and some topics, you know, begin at a certain grade level. So if that works for you, that's fine. But as a general rule, I always say try to stay within the band, you know, within your grade level band. And now let's try to differentiate what's proficiency, what's needed to do that you're going to teach, and what's going above and beyond that, still staying within that topic at that grade level band. You agree with that, Matt? Yes, no?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I want to follow up a little bit of that, because if we take this question as is, where you have content at the 2 level in one scale and at the 3 level in a lower scale, eventually what catches up to you is kids will notice that, and they'll look at the scale and they'll say, Mr. Shea, I've already learned this back here in a prior grade level, or last year, or whatever it may be. I've already shown I've learned this. Can you give me credit for it right now? And yeah, I've been through this experience where we've kind of duplicated those scales a little bit. So I do think it's important to make those different, that it kind of blurs the line for grade levels at that point, and it becomes about the learning, which may be a little bit more advanced for some people at the moment, but you're going to run into some of these issues. And as you just said, Bob, do what works for you for now, knowing that you're always going to have to tweak those scales anyway, as a response for what kids are learning and what you want them to do. But try not to duplicate things among scales. It's difficult at that point.
Yeah, one other thing on this too. When a school or district is creating scales first, somebody will always say, why don't we do that? And it's a good logical way of thinking, you know, and it does decrease the amount of work you have to do, you know, but like I say, I think it robs the teacher, robs the curriculum developers of the opportunity to really get finely tuned in terms of how they define what content are we expecting of you. Ultimately, I think it works against you in terms of the effectiveness of your instruction and assessments.
Agreed.
Okay, so Tammy had a follow-up question based on the conversation that we're having here live. She said, so for schools that aren't using numbers like 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, et cetera, but are using categorical scales like getting started, progressing, and mastery, how do you combat the student who feels stalled out at a level?
Matt, you take that. I don't quite understand the question.
I get to go first. Awesome.
Yes.
So a lot of people use scales where instead of using the numbers, they use categorical scales, as Tammy says, or letters. Like getting started would be a 1, progressing would be a 2, and mastery would be a 3. And you're right. Tammy's right. That is a little more difficult because that's just the equivalent of using the whole point scales. So there's no wiggle room for that half point to see how kids are. One district that I work with has combated that by using something simple like just getting started plus, progressing plus, mastery plus. So you're having those half points in there with the same theories that we talked about before. So getting started plus would mean I know all of that getting started level and a little bit at that next progressing level, but not all of it yet to get me to progressing. So the same theory, we just want to be able to have a half point score, even if we name it something else. So that might be something, Tammy, that we might want to think about with the scales that you have. It's a great question. Thank you. She follows up with, I like that, thanks. And
if I can,
question, so
if I can just add something to that, I don't know if Tammy is, many of the people who have joined today are actual Empower LMS clients. We were built to facilitate grading on a proficiency scale based or basis. So if Tammy is with a district that is with Empower,
yep,
we can support the type of gradation that Matt just suggested. Mm-hmm. So just know that that is a definitive yes if you're in that category.
Yep.
So, okay, we have probably time for like maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Please submit those. We're actively checking those live, as you have noticed. But one additional question was, why are scales better than just flat out statements of student work or student progress?
Go ahead, Matt.
So this was like when I started with the standards-based system that I talked about in the webinar part. We started with just identifying standards and nothing else, no scales, no nothing. I had no idea what scales were. So we're working on the standard level, and then it was up to me as the teacher to interpret that standard for the kids that were in front of me. So if we think about what a scale is right now, where we have identified that mastery level, that standard level, and then trying to figure out, okay, what are the pieces that kids will have to learn to get to that standard? You know, if I'm thinking as a scale point of view, my interpretation of a standard may be very different than Sean's, which may be very different than Bob's, which may be very different from Kevin's. And now you're not creating that equity within the classrooms that we want to do. So it depends on the teacher how to interpret the standard at that point, as opposed to having the scale be the transparency of learning that all kids are expected to meet. That's how I kind of interpret that question a little bit.
Okay, good. We have a really good question from Alyssa. So she says, what is the best way to begin to train parents and families with proficiency scales? They are so, emphasis on so, stuck on associating the 1, 2, 3, 4 with a DCBA letter grade. I teach kindergarten, so I get to be the first one to introduce and help train our families. What do you recommend to help them understand all the educational vocab and language?
Well, first of all, please remember that, or recognize the fact that you can still translate scores on proficiency scales to letter grades. You can also translate them into percentage scores. And we've actually we've created some conversion charts that Sean will send to you if you want to see that. So you can do that. You can still have overall letter grades if you wish. It really, the decision is, well, gee, let's say that they're, and if you're going to do, let's say, that I've taught over this grading period, we've addressed 5 different topics, measurement topics. So every student has a summative score, final summative score in each one of those topics. How do I put those together? Well, you can actually average those. And then the big question is, where does the A start? Where does the B start? And that's a value-driven decision. What most schools, in my experience, do is they say, well, the A then has to start at the 3.0 level because this 3.0 score says that they're proficient. So there's a logic now to your letter grades. Where does the B start? Well, if you're, so it was stated differently, they would be making the decision that if across these 5 measurement topics, the student's average was 3.1, then they're A category. Where does the B start? Very commonly people say, well, the average should be about 2.5, and which now means something. It means, hey, their central tendency is they've got all the simpler content, and some of the more complex content. And that said, I've been in places, I was a high school in Michigan, I forgot the name of the school, but they said in this high school, our A starts at a 3.25. And I said, you realize what you're saying is to get an A, you have to have some topics on which you're above proficiency. And they said, yeah, and those are our values. That's great, but it's now really interpretable of what they meant. Now that didn't directly answer your question. I just was trying to say, hey, you really can turn it into those those traditional letter grades. I found that if you have the conversation with parents that I just had with you, and then say, okay, but we're still just going to use these numbers on the proficiency scale. They get it. They really do.
Yep.
Matt, yes, no?
Yeah, I would agree that it's conversations that are never going to end with your parents, especially you, Alyssa, at the kindergarten level. You have new parents coming in every year. So we can just figure out how to talk to them about meeting proficiency is a very different bar than like getting a C or a D in order to pass. If we're holding all of our kids to be proficient on all these scales that we have, that's a very different bar for all of our kids to reach. And if they reach that bar, doesn't it make sense that that would be the equivalent of an A that you're most likely familiar with as a student who's probably been through an A to F system in the United States? So there's a lot of further conversation with that, but it starts by talking about the scale and how to interpret that and what that means for your student coming into school. It's a great conversation to have, and it never ends. And you get better at it a little bit every time. And Bob's right. They'll get it. They just need to have the conversation. If we just assume they know things, that's not going to work out at all. Conversation.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be over, but I think one thing that really doesn't work is when a school their proficiency scales do not actually list the content.
Yep.
It doesn't describe they just use a generic scale. Now that is really hard. First of all, I think that's not a useful practice. I really do. Right. But they'll say, what does it say? They're at standard. If you look at our next 2 sessions, you'll see we'll talk about. So what, in math, what does it look like? In science, what does it look like? Et cetera, et cetera. And once, so imagine a parent, of a 4th grader in mathematics, and you start the year by saying, oh yeah, and here's, we're going to be going through these 20 topics, and here are the scales for each of the 20. Most parents are, wow, that's nice. I really get to see where they, yeah. So you can't just talk in the abstract,
yep,
relative to scales when you're talking to parents, and rightfully they want to know what does this mean in terms of specific content.
Mm-hmm.
And a specific approach to that I've seen that I think is really successful. I've seen schools and districts who have had their somebody at the district level, perhaps, or school level administrator record a really tight, concise video explaining the difference between a traditional approach, that the community might be familiar with. And this shift that they've made to a standards reference approach, the why behind it, and a explanation of why the grades are what they are. And that is something that if the teacher is being asked questions by a parent, that can easily be shared. It can be posted on the school or district's website. So I think, and obviously that can live for the long term. So that's been really successful. Okay, last question, and then we'll wrap up here. So here's a question from Kevin. If converting to a grade or a percentage, what happens when a student gets something below proficient, B, C, or D? Should this be their final score and then move on to the next level of proficiency scales? Do they stick with these proficiency scales and try to improve these grades the next year?
Okay, that's the distinction between standards-based versus standards reference helps a little bit here. The terms competency-based, standards-based, standards, they get used, a lot, and sometimes it gets a little fuzzy as to what exactly they mean. Here's what standards-based is, or competency-based, kind of means the same thing. And that is fourth grade mathematics, 20 topics, that I get scored on. I don't move to fifth grade mathematics until I get a 3.0 on all 20 of those. That's competency-based or standards-based. A standards reference would be, I'm in fourth grade mathematics for 9 months. On the 20 topics, I have a summative score on each one. Those are that I move to the next level, even if I don't have a 3 on all of those, and that's the difference. We're in a true competency-based system, of course, where the scary part is, what if it's the end of the year and I've got a 3 on 19 of the 20, but not one of those. I haven't reached competency on one of those. Next year, do I go back into fourth grade mathematics? And the answer is no. That's the one topic that I catch up on, and that can be done, in a summer session, that can be done after school, that could be done online. So that's the way of allowing students to keep up with the pace, even though they didn't reach competency on all of your topics in a given year.
Okay. Good. Well, that is about all the time we have for today. Our intention, even though this is a really large topic, our intention was to keep these pretty short and tight and concise, and which is why we've split them out, this topic in general, out over 3 webinars. So we'll use the same format for the upcoming 2. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you in the next 2 sessions with us, as well as future sessions and other topics. So thank you and have a great day.